A black man in a luxury car is handcuffed, searched and silenced by police until a single name shatters everything. He wasn't just another suspect, he was the judge. What happens next turns a routine stop into a national reckoning. This isn't just a story, it's a system on trial. It's wonderful to have you here. I'm David, your storyteller on this channel. Before we dive into this shocking mystery, let us know where you're watching from in the comments, and if you love gripping, jaw-dropping stories, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. The morning sun cast long golden streaks across the quiet rest stop just off I-94, where maple trees swayed lazily in the breeze and the smell of brewed coffee lingered from a nearby vending station. Parked neatly between two empty spots sat a sleek black Tesla Windows, clear engine softly humming its occupant still and composed. Inside sat Judge Theodore Langston, 62, dignified in a tailored navy suit, his graying beard neatly trimmed and his leather briefcase balanced on his lap. He tapped thoughtfully on his tablet, reviewing case notes for an upcoming judicial ethics roundtable with the governor. The silence in his car was peaceful, but not unfamiliar. After decades on the bench, Langston had learned to find stillness in moments of transition. Yet beneath the calm, there was a faint tension, one he had carried his whole life. A black man in a luxury car alone still had to calculate his every move, every stop, every glance. He was aware of it, like a dull ache in the background. And then the ache sharpened. A Michigan State Police cruiser slowed as it passed. Langston noticed in his peripheral vision a slight hesitation, a glance, the faint squeal of brakes. He looked up from his screen. The officer didn't continue past the rest stop. Instead, the cruiser reversed slowly, tires crunching against gravel, and stopped a few yards behind his Tesla. A familiar script began to write itself in Langston's mind, one he had heard played out in courtroom testimony again and again. I was just sitting there. Then the lights came on. Officer Garrett Sloan stepped out of the cruiser, with an assertive gate hand already brushing against the grip of his holstered pistol. His mirrored sunglasses reflected the sky, but his posture radiated suspicion. He didn't announce himself, didn't offer a greeting. He simply stared at the car lips' tight expression, unreadable. Langston sighed softly, set his tablet aside, and rolled down the window. He placed both hands clearly on the steering wheel, the universal gesture of survival. "Good morning, officer. Is everything all right?" he asked, tone calm but clear. Sloan didn't answer right away. He scanned Langston from head to toe, clean-cut, professional, deliberate, and frowned as if trying to decode a puzzle that didn't quite make sense. Finally he spoke. "We got a report of a stolen vehicle matching this description, leaving a gas station nearby. I need you to step out of the car." There was no stolen vehicle. Langston knew it. And Sloan knew it too. His voice lacked urgency, his words robotic, like a shield for an action he had already decided to take. Langston blinked slowly, not in fear, but in measured disbelief. "I'm not aware of any such report," he said evenly. "I've just stopped for a few minutes to review notes before heading into Lansing. If you'd like, I can show you my registration and ID." But Sloan took a step back and unsnapped the holster strap. "Step out. Now." His voice dropped, the pretense no longer investigative, but commanding. Langston paused, heart beating with the rhythm of 1,000 memories. His father pulled over at gunpoint in 1973. His nephew searched on the sidewalk in front of his own house. Young black men in his courtroom, broken not by guilt, but by the weight of assumption. Now here he was, a chief judge reduced in a heartbeat to suspicion made flesh. He opened the door slowly and rose to his full 6'2" frame. Sloan's stance stiffened slightly, hand still near his weapon. Langston said nothing. He refused to argue on the side of a highway, like a man begging for dignity. Instead he stood still, back straight. Breathing steady, his resistance was in his restraint. A second cruiser arrived. Officer Renee Maddox, younger and quieter, stepped out and stood by Sloan without a word. Her eyes flickered uneasily between Langston and her partner, but she offered no question, no pause. Sloan barked, "Hands behind your back." Langston's expression barely changed. "I'd like to know what I'm being accused of." "You're interfering with an investigation," Sloan snapped, reaching for Langston's wrist. "What investigation?" he asked, voice low, sharp. "You haven't run my license. You haven't even checked my name." That was all it took. Sloan grabbed him, twisted his arm with practiced aggression, and forced on the handcuffs. Maddox moved in, silently securing the other wrist. A few bystanders watched from a distance, one recording with their phone, another shaking their head in disbelief. Langston didn't resist. But his silence wasn't surrender. It was calculation. Behind his stillness was a storm gathering. A line had been crossed, and as the metal cuffs bit into his skin, he didn't look at Sloan. He looked past him toward the courtroom, the governor's table, the cameras not yet rolling, because this was far from over. The midday sun burned brighter now, casting harsh reflections off the hood of the black Tesla, as Judge Theodore Langston stood quietly at the rear of his vehicle, wrist shackled behind his back like a common criminal. His shoulders remained square, his posture unbroken, but inside something trembled, not from fear but from fury wrapped in restraint. His mind reeled with every protocol he knew by heart, every constitutional right being trampled in real time. He had presided over hundreds of cases, heard testimonies from men who had stood exactly where he now stood, shamed, profiled, violated. He had always believed he understood. But this was different. This was him. The law wasn't abstract anymore. It was pressing into his skin in the form of cold, unearned steel. Officer Garrett Sloan paced a few feet away, smug and alert, calling in what he described over the radio as a non-compliant suspect. Langston turned his head slightly, catching those words in the air like poison. He had complied, fully, willingly, respectfully, and yet here he was categorized, downgraded, reduced to a code on a radio frequency. Officer Renee Maddox hovered nearby, her eyes shifting with unease. She hadn't said a word since placing the second cuff. Her silence screamed complicity, and Langston felt its weight. She looked young, maybe early 30s, and the discomfort in her expression flickered like a cracked light bulb. But she didn't speak, didn't question, didn't move, and silence in moments like this was as loud as violence. Langston's voice finally cut through the stagnant air, calm, low, but loaded. I would like to know again what I'm being accused of. Sloan didn't answer. Instead, he walked back toward the Tesla, glancing at the onlookers gathering near the vending machines. A college student in a hoodie was filming from across the lot. A woman with a child stared in confused horror. Still, Sloan marched forward as if performing for no one. He reached the driver's side, opened the door without permission, and leaned inside, rummaging through the glove compartment with loud, clumsy hands. Langston took a small step forward, voice steady as stone. Officer, I do not consent to a search of my vehicle. Sloan shot upright, slamming the door. That's obstruction, he barked, eyes wild with manufactured outrage. You're interfering with an active investigation. What investigation? Langston repeated louder, now firmer. You haven't even asked for my ID. You've made no attempt to verify anything I've said. Sloan stormed toward him, fury now masquerading as authority. You don't get to play lawyer out here, he snarled. You don't get to dictate what I do. Langston didn't flinch, not because he wasn't shaken, but because he refused to give Sloan the reaction. He was hunting for the escalation. He wanted to justify this abuse. His restraint was more than control. It was his shield. It was the only weapon he had left. I'm not playing anything, he replied. I'm telling you that I know the law, and I know this isn't it. Sloan stepped closer, nose nearly inches away, trying to crowd him, intimidate him. Langston met his gaze head-on, his breath calm, his eyes sharp. This wasn't a battle of noise. This was a battle of presence. Behind them, the college student's phone camera continued rolling. The tension had thickened now, no longer quiet suspicion, but boiling hostility, unjustified and exposed. Langston's wrists ached in the cuffs. His back was stiff from standing, but he refused to bend. His resistance was not rage, it was refusal. Refusal to be dehumanized. Refusal to shrink. Refusal to be another anonymous statistic who never got the chance to speak. Sloan walked away briefly, speaking into his shoulder radio. Langston heard the code words, backup non-compliant, possible resistance. It was all performance built on a lie, and he knew how those lies took root in official reports, how they shaped narratives that buried truth beneath red tape and bureaucracy. A soft voice suddenly broke the haze. Are we sure about this? Maddox asked quietly, her voice barely audible. Sloan glared back. We've got protocol to follow. You saw the way he acted. Langston heard it, the echo of a justification born from bias. She had seen the way he acted with patience, with dignity, with obedience. But none of that mattered. He didn't match the narrative in Sloan's head, so Sloan built a new one. Langston turned to Maddox, locking eyes with her. "You still have time to do the right thing," he said, not as a threat, but as a truth. "The badge doesn't protect you from accountability." She looked away. He stood there cuffed, violated, but not broken. Not even close. Inside he was cataloging everything, every word, every misstep, every breach of protocol. The wheels of justice had not stopped turning. They were just turning slower, quieter. But they were turning. And when they did, Langston knew this confrontation would become history. The chains of injustice didn't always rattle. Sometimes they clicked shut with quiet certainty, like the final note of a verdict already written. Judge Theodore Langston stood at the edge of the parking lot, hands cuffed behind him, as if the law itself had turned its back on him. Officer Garrett Sloan stayed close, shoulders puffed, scanning the surroundings like he'd subdued a threat rather than humiliated a man. Officer Renee Maddox stood just behind her, silence clinging to the scene like morning fog, present lingering, impossible to ignore. Langston's heart thudded, not from panic, but from profound disbelief. He had spent a lifetime defending the rule of law. Now shackled by its twisted application, he wondered how many more men had stood in his place, erased in the margins of police reports and tagged with accusations that didn't match the truth, but matched their skin. People were watching now. A small crowd had formed near the coffee vending machine, their expressions ranging from stunned confusion to quiet dread. Among them, a young black college student gripped her phone tightly, the red recording light flashing as she whispered to her friend, "He didn't do anything. He's just standing there." An older white man, gray beard and worn Army vet jacket, crossed his arms and muttered, "That man doesn't look like someone who stole a damn thing." But their voices floated on the wind, powerless to stop what had already happened. Langston's eyes were calm, but far from still. He wasn't thinking of escape or argument. He was calculating. Every gesture, every word exchanged, every unlawful action taken, he was engraving it in his memory like testimony on the record. His inner turmoil was not the panic of the innocent, but the exhaustion of the overproven. He had done everything right, complied, spoken respectfully, offered documentation. But for Sloan, none of it mattered. To him, Langston was just another black man in a nice car, automatically suspicious, automatically wrong. As Sloan opened the back door of the cruiser, Langston hesitated. It wasn't resistance. It was reflection. This wasn't the first time someone in a uniform had decided that power gave them permission. It wasn't the first time a man's life was defined by a glance, a gut feeling soaked in bias. But this time the man was him, and this time he would not disappear into the system. He was the system. Sloan shoved him forward without a word. Langston caught himself against the roof of the car, ducked down and slid into the back seat, the same seat that had held so many defendants whose cases had landed in his courtroom. The door slammed shut. And for the first time in his long legal career, he was the one behind the glass, watching the world shrink through the barred lens of injustice. Inside the precinct just outside Battle Creek, the atmosphere was sterile, indifferent. Langston was led through side doors, not with violence, but with dismissive routine, as if this were just another box to check another body in the system. The booking officer barely glanced up, typing his name as if it meant nothing. Langston Theodore. Black male. Age 62. Reason, suspicion, obstruction. No one noticed the title listed on his driver's license. No one paused long enough to ask why a man in a custom suit, with credentials thicker than their entire personnel files, was being held without explanation. He sat in a hard plastic chair, the red marks from the cuffs still burning against his skin. 3 times he asked calm, direct, respectful to make a phone call, to notify his office, to alert someone he had a scheduled meeting with the governor's judicial advisory panel in Lansing. 3 times he was ignored or waved off. He wasn't shouting, he wasn't resisting, and somehow that made him even more suspicious, as if composure itself was a trick, as if dignity was a disguise. From across the room, officers watched him with narrowed eyes. One muttered, "He looks too calm. Probably hiding something." Another smirked. "Yeah, thinks he's special." Langston heard every word, but he didn't blink. Not because it didn't hurt because it did deeply, but because he refused to give them the satisfaction. He would not raise his voice. He would not demand to be treated like a man. He was a man, a judge, a symbol of justice, and if they couldn't see it, that would be their shame to carry, not his. In that moment, as he sat among careless officers and false assumptions, Langston's resistance took root not in rage, but in stillness. A stillness that spoke louder than any defense, a stillness that whispered, "You will not bury me in this lie." A stillness that began to pull the cracks apart one by one until the entire facade of righteousness would come crashing down, and when it did, the system that tried to erase him would finally be forced to answer for what it had become. The fluorescent lights in the precinct flickered, with a sterile hum casting a cold clinical glow on walls, the color of faded ash. Judge Theodore Langston sat in a hard plastic chair along the holding bench. His wrists now free, but the red marks told the story the officers refused to see. They were the outline of a verdict rendered not in a courtroom, but on the side of a highway by a badge, a bias and a lie. Around him the station buzzed with casual indifference, keyboards clicked, radios, crackled doors opened and shut with rhythm, but no awareness. To them, he was just another black man pulled in under suspicion, another form to process, another body in a system that didn't care who he really was. He had asked 3 times once to the booking officer, twice to Officer Renee Maddox to make a phone call. Not to a lawyer, to his own office. "There's a judicial ethics roundtable at the Capitol," he explained clearly. "They're expecting me." But each time his request was met with a dismissive shrug or vague delay. One officer even laughed. "You got a lunch date with the governor, too." Langston didn't respond. He was done explaining himself. The law was supposed to protect dignity. But here in this room, dignity wasn't just absent, it was offensive to them. If you're watching this and finding it really interesting, but happen to be busy with something else right now, feel free to subscribe to our channel. That way, this video will be easier to find later, so you can come back and continue the story when you have more time. Across the room, Officer Garrett Sloan leaned against the wall, arms crossed, jaw clenched in quiet pride. He watched Langston like a man waiting for a fuse to burn out, ready for the explosion he thought would come. But it didn't. Langston sat still, posture straight, not in defiance, but in discipline. He knew exactly what was happening. He had ruled on cases just like this. He had heard testimonies from men who were mocked, delayed, ignored, whose calmness was twisted into suspicion, and whose fear was never believed. What he never admitted to those men, even as he gave them justice, was that deep down he had always wondered if he would one day be one of them, and now he was. He scanned the room. None of them had noticed the suede, the polished shoes, the soft leather briefcase they hadn't bothered to search. They saw his skin, his silence, and they made their judgment. One officer glanced his way and said to another, loud enough for him to hear, "He's sitting too quiet, probably thinking up some lawsuit." The other chuckled. "Let him. He won't win." Langston didn't flinch. He'd already won because he hadn't cracked. Not when they cuffed him. Not when they ignored him. Not when they treated his constitutional rights like clutter. Maddox passed through again, and for a moment their eyes met. Her gaze held something, guilt maybe, or recognition. But it flickered and vanished as quickly as it appeared. She said nothing. Langston didn't need her words. He needed her courage, and she didn't have it. Not today. The room shifted when Sergeant Camille Mercer walked in. She was in her early 50s, eyes sharp beneath a neat bun, her uniform pressed with military precision. She carried an air of command not through volume, but through clarity. She stopped at the intake desk, flipping through the log sheet. "How long's this one been sitting here?" she asked, nodding toward Langston. "Nearly 2 hours." "Obstruction," someone replied. Mercer frowned. "You have ID?" They nodded. "Did anyone run it?" A shrug. "We've been swamped." Something in her tightened. She walked over to the nearest terminal and typed his name, Theodore L. Langston. It took 3 seconds, and then the screen changed. Judicial records, court history, academic credentials, awards, appointments, a headshot in formal robes, the search result that shattered the illusion. Her face stilled. Slowly she turned and looked through the glass at the man sitting alone, waiting not for freedom, but for truth to catch up. She moved quickly, the taps of her boots echoing through the floor, like judgment descending. Sloan barely glanced up as she entered the holding area. Maddox stood off to the side, pale now, lips tight. Mercer stopped in front of Langston, her voice even, but marked with something deeper accountability. "Sir," she said. "You said you had a meeting in Lansing." Langston looked up, eyes level. "Yes, with the governor's judicial panel." "Noon." Her voice dropped. And you are Judge Theodore Langston." He nodded once. Behind her, Sloane straightened. "Wait, what do you mean?" Judge Mercer didn't turn. "You arrested a sitting state judge without probable cause. You denied him his right to contact counsel. You searched his vehicle without a warrant." Her words fell like stones in the room. Maddox looked down. Sloane opened his mouth, but no excuse came. Langston rose slowly, the weight of injustice still on his back, but the tide finally beginning to shift. It wasn't over. But it had begun. The system had looked away long enough. Now it would have no choice but to see. The precinct buzzed like any other weekday afternoon officers, passed through corridors with coffee cups and casual chatter screens, flickered with open reports, and the hum of printers echoed from every corner. But in the center of it all, Judge Theodore Langston sat in silence, the eye of a storm no one yet knew was forming. The hard plastic chair beneath him groaned with each shift of his weight, but he didn't move much. His suit, still crisp, had begun to crease from hours of tension, his cuffs now off, but his dignity bruised. 2 hours had passed since his unlawful arrest, and still no call, no recognition, no apology. Just muttered comments and sidelong glances. To them he was a man out of place, suspicious in stillness, guilty in calm. The badge had made the assumption, and the uniform protected it. Then came Sergeant Camille Mercer. She stepped into the intake area with the quiet force of a woman who commanded authority without raising her voice. Tall, disciplined early 50s with gray streaks in her otherwise dark hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Mercer didn't saunter like the others, she moved with purpose. She paused near the front desk and flipped through the holding logs. Her gaze narrowed when she landed on one entry. Langston Theodore, L., black male, age 62, obstruction suspected vehicle match. She frowned. "Who processed Langston?" she asked, tone crisp. Booking started with Officer Sloane, someone mumbled from behind a terminal. "Didn't finish yet. Been kind of slow." "Has his ID been verified?" Mercer asked. A shrug. He gave it. But Sloane said he was being difficult, so... Mercer's stare hardened. "You got his ID in hand and no one ran it." The air around her changed. She didn't wait for another excuse. She crossed the floor to the nearest workstation and typed the name in herself. The screen loaded in under 5 seconds. Mercer expected a license profile, maybe a clean background, but what appeared instead made her freeze mid-breath. Theodore L. Langston, Presiding Judge 12th Judicial Circuit, State of Michigan. Harvard Law, former federal clerk. Appellate appointments. Civil Rights Oversight Board. Judicial Reform Leadership. Dozens of published legal opinions. Numerous awards for service. She clicked his official photo. It was him. The same man now sitting 3 rooms away, waiting like a prisoner in the very system he served. Her pulse quickened, not from surprise, but from fury. Fury that no one had bothered to look. Fury that bias had moved faster than facts. Fury that a man whose signature shaped the law in this state had been treated like a threat simply for sitting in his own car. She rose from the chair, her boots hitting the tile with sharp intent as she made her way down the hallway toward the holding room. As she passed, officers looked up from their desks. They could read her face. Something had changed. Something was coming. Inside the holding area, Sloane leaned smugly against the wall, chatting with another officer, still basking in the authority he had so confidently abused. Maddox lingered to the side, arms crossed, staring down at the floor like it might absolve her silence. Mercer pushed the door open. "Sloane," she said coldly. He straightened. "Ma'am." "You arrested a sitting judge?" She said, her voice even but razor sharp. "You cuffed him, searched his vehicle without consent, denied him access to counsel, and you didn't even run his identification. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Sloane's face paled. He didn't say he was a judge. He didn't act like Mercer cut him off. "You had his ID. That was your job. And you failed." She turned to Maddox. "And you helped him do it." Langston looked up as she turned to him. She studied his face, still calm, still composed, but the weight behind his eyes had shifted. The silence that had once been helpless had become dangerous, strategic, prepared. "Your Honor," she said softly, "I'm deeply sorry. This should never have happened. Would you like to contact the governor's office now, or would you prefer we arrange a direct escort to Lansing Langston?" Gave a small nod, his voice low but measured. "Yes. That would be appreciated?" His eyes never left Sloane, who now stood frozen in the corner. stripped of certainty, stripped of control. Mercer nodded and gestured toward the hallway. The door opened. The man they had cuffed, searched, and dismissed as a nobody now walked freely through the precinct, not with arrogance, but with an air that could not be denied any longer. Officers turned as he passed, confusion and quiet shame on their faces. The truth had arrived, and it had a name they would never forget. The atmosphere in the precinct had shifted, though many didn't yet realize it. The usual buzz, the banter, the radio. Dispatches, the casual shuffle of uniformed movement still echoed off the tile and metal. But beneath it, tension stirred quiet and corrosive. Something was unraveling. At its center stood Judge Theodore Langston, once dismissed as just another suspect, now standing tall beside Sergeant Camille Mercer, who had returned to the holding area like a thundercloud ready to split open the truth. Her eyes had already pierced through the haze of arrogance and assumption, but the others were still living in the before they knew who he really was, before the lie cracked. The moment broke wide open with one word. "Your Honor." The silence was immediate. Sloan blinked, his weight shifting like the floor had dropped an inch beneath him. Maddox froze mid-step. The smirk that had lingered on Sloan's face since the roadside encounter vanished, replaced by the fragile expression of a man who'd realized he hadn't just made a mistake. He had detonated a career-ending scandal. Langston didn't respond right away. His face remained composed, but the flicker in his eyes revealed the moment wasn't lost on him. After 2 hours of being treated like a criminal, cuffed, searched, ignored, and silenced, he was finally being acknowledged for who he truly was. Not a threat, not a suspect, but a sitting judge of the 12th Judicial Circuit, a man whose decisions shaped the lives of thousands. Yet what should have been vindication felt like something colder. Confirmation of what he already knew, that dignity in black skin was always conditional, always contingent, always one verification away from being believed. Sergeant Mercer turned to Sloan. Her tone wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. "You arrested a state judge without probable cause. You searched his vehicle without a warrant. You denied him his right to contact legal representation. You ignored every part of protocol you were trained to follow." Sloan opened his mouth, desperate to cling to authority. "He didn't identify himself. He gave you his ID." Mercer snapped, her voice rising just enough to cut through the room like a gavel. "It had his title on it. Your job was to check it. Instead, you escalated." The shame on Sloan's face deepened into a muted panic. He turned toward Maddox, searching for backup, but she was already shrinking into the background. Her jaw tightened. She couldn't meet his eyes. Langston finally spoke, his voice calm but razor-edged. "You saw a man who didn't look like he belonged behind the wheel of a luxury car parked alone at a rest stop. You didn't see a judge. You saw a profile. He let the words hang there. And you decided that was enough." No one in the room dared speak. The officers at their desks had gone silent, pretending to look busy, but everyone was listening. Langston's voice didn't rise. He didn't need to shout. The restraint in his tone measured unwavering. Haunted with experience carried more power than any outburst. Sergeant Mercer stepped back beside him. "Sir, if you're ready, we'll escort you now. The governor's staff has been informed. They're expecting you." Langston nodded once, turning without another glance at Sloan. As he walked, the precinct parted. Officers who had snickered when he entered now stood still, their eyes avoiding his gaze. Even those who hadn't seen the arrest now felt the tremor in the air. He didn't walk like a man who had been let go. He walked like a man who had decided to expose the system from within. Cameras caught them as they exited Langston in his suit briefcase in hand, escorted not by guards, but by accountability. Mercer beside him, phone pressed to her ear, coordinating logistics with the Capitol. Outside, the world was already catching up. The viral video, 30 seconds of footage showing a judge in cuffs asking calmly, "What have I done wrong?" was spreading across TikTok, Twitter, and every headline that hadn't yet dared to imagine how deep the rot went. Langston paused at the top of the steps outside the precinct, the wind catching the corner of his coat. He took a breath. Not of relief, but of recommitment. This wasn't just his story anymore. It was the story of every black man who had been silenced without cause, and of a system that needed to be forced on camera to tell the truth. The reveal had happened, but the reckoning was only beginning. The footage was only 28 seconds long. No special effects, no commentary, no music. Just raw, uncut reality. A black man in a suit, hands cuffed behind his back, standing silently beside a black Tesla at a rest stop. A white officer rummaging through the car without a warrant. The man's voice calm and low-cut through the audio. I have done nothing wrong. I do not consent to this search. It wasn't a confrontation, it was a confession of a system on tape. And by the time the sun began to set over Michigan that day, the video was already racing across TikTok, Twitter, and Facebook like a lightning bolt aimed straight at the heart of American conscience. The caption read simply, "Arrested for being black in a suit. Judge Langston." It was posted by a college student, Aaliyah James, who had filmed the incident from across the lot while sipping coffee in her car. Her voice, heard faintly in the background of the video, cracked with disbelief. He didn't do anything. This is insane. Within an hour, the clip hit 100,000 views. By nightfall, it had crossed over 2 million. Hashtags surged. Justice for Langston. Truer, black and broad. Daylight. Juror judged by color. National outrage ignited not because this was the first time, but because this time the victim wasn't voiceless. He was a judge. And people could no longer pretend the system was blind. News outlets moved fast. CNN replayed the video every hour, their chyron reading, "State judge detained. Without cause, civil rights groups demand action." MSNBC aired a panel of legal scholars and former prosecutors, many of them visibly shaken, dissecting the clear violations of constitutional rights. Fox News tried to spin it as a procedural miscommunication, but even their guests hesitated. A storm was coming, and it didn't care about spin. In the halls of power, alarms rang louder. The governor of Michigan's office issued a statement by midnight confirming Judge Theodore Langston had been scheduled to attend a justice reform roundtable, the day of the arrest, adding tersely, "This matter is under urgent review. We remain committed to fairness, dignity, and equal treatment under the law." Behind-the-scenes calls were made. District attorneys, civil rights attorneys, elected officials. They all knew what the public would soon demand, not just apologies, accountability. Outside the precinct where Langston had been detained, protesters gathered before dawn. Some held handmade signs that read, "Dignity in cuffs, black bench white bias." "He is the system you swore to uphold." Their chants were not loud at first. They were steady, intentional. "Say his name, Judge Langston." News crews arrived, and with them the nation's gaze. But perhaps the most powerful reaction came not from the street, but from within. Inside the very station that had held him, the video played on every desktop passed between officers like a mirror some couldn't bear to face. The jokes had stopped. The laughter vanished. Officer Maddox didn't speak. Her eyes were hollow, her silence now heavy with regret. Officer Sloan, once confident, was now sweating under the fluorescent lights of internal review. Word spread quickly, an emergency meeting was being convened. The state attorney general's office was involved. A misconduct hearing was imminent. The uniform no longer shielded them. The lie had been filmed. Meanwhile, Judge Langston sat alone in a quiet room within the Capitol building, preparing for the roundtable he'd nearly missed. He had said little to the press, refusing interviews, ignoring the requests flooding his phone. But within him a storm still raged, not of vengeance, but of purpose. The humiliation had been public, yes, but so was the truth. And that truth now had reach. It had weight. It had a face. His face. He reflected not on the handcuffs or the search, or even the cold silence of the holding cell, but on how close he had come to being erased. Had he not been a judge, had the student not filmed, had Mercer not checked the system? How many times had this exact scenario played out in darkness? How many others sat in jails right now, nameless, voiceless, buried beneath assumptions and unchecked power? Langston knew this moment wasn't about him, not entirely. It was about every man pulled over for fitting a description. Every woman told she was hostile for asserting her rights. Every teenager cuffed for standing still. This moment was about turning visibility into justice. By the next morning, newspapers from coast to coast ran the same headline in one form or another: "Judge handcuffed without cause, system on trial." And somewhere in the rustle of newsprint, in the fury of retweets and national debates, the echo of Langston's quiet resistance was finally heard, not as a whisper, but as a reckoning. By the time Judge Theodore Langston stepped through the grand marble doors of the Michigan State Capitol the next morning, the world outside had already shifted. His name was etched across headlines and chyrons, his still image in handcuffs plastered across timelines, and his silence, calm, composed, undeniable, had pierced the nation like a verdict against its own conscience. But inside Langston, the weight hadn't lifted. It had merely refocused. He wasn't walking into that chamber to reclaim his dignity. It had never truly left him. He was walking in to confront a machine that had tried to strip it away. And this time he wasn't coming as a victim. He was coming as a reckoning. The roundtable, originally scheduled as a policy meeting on court efficiency and budget reform, now pulsed with electricity. What had been a bureaucratic checklist had become a high-stakes forum for systemic accountability. As Langston entered the room rose not because protocol required it, but because the moral ground had shifted. Every figure in that chamber, from state legislators to police commissioners, attorneys general, to judicial peers, stood not for his title but for the raw truth that had just unraveled in full view of the public. The governor, seated at the center, leaned forward with solemn gravity. "Judge Langston, we're honored to have you here," he said. Langston offered a nod, eyes level. "The timing, Governor," he replied, "speaks for itself." Before the agenda could begin, Langston raised his hand slightly. "With your permission, I'd like to say something first." A hush fell. Yesterday morning, he began, his voice low but resonant. "I was stopped without cause, handcuffed without evidence, searched without consent, and detained without dignity. I was on my way to this very meeting representing a state committed, at least on paper, to justice. And yet for 2 hours I wasn't a judge. I wasn't even a man. I was a silhouette, a suspicion, a risk behind tinted glass." His voice never trembled, but the weight behind every word tightened the air. He paused, scanning the faces across the room. Some nodded solemnly. Others looked down. "This is not just about me," he continued. "This is about the thousands of black men and women who don't get to walk into a room like this and be heard, whose truth is not filmed, whose names do not trend. Trust cannot exist where dignity is conditional, and law without accountability is just performance." The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was charged. Within minutes, the room pivoted. The policy documents were pushed aside. The microphones turned on. What had been a scheduled meeting became a live emergency session. Civil rights advocates were patched in, legal advisors were summoned, and by noon the state attorney general had formally called for a judicial oversight review of the entire arrest. Then came the moment no one had anticipated. A proposal was drafted to initiate misconduct proceedings against officers Garrett Sloan and Renee Maddox. And in a bold, unprecedented move after legal clearance from the governor's council, the room unanimously voted to appoint Judge Theodore Langston himself to preside over the emergency review as a neutral arbiter. Langston hesitated. "I do not seek vengeance," he said quietly. "I only seek truth. But if this chamber believes I can serve that truth with fairness, I will do my duty." 2 hours later, the review commenced in a formal hearing room below the Capitol. Press filled the gallery. State officials took their seats. Officers Sloan and Maddox were escorted in, no longer emboldened by uniform or silence. Sloan's hands twitched. Maddox stared at the floor, pale. Langston sat at the head of the panel, flanked by 2 fellow judges. "This is not a spectacle," he opened. "This is a legal review to determine whether conduct violated both policy and principle. Evidence was presented, the body cam footage, the student video witness statements, dispatch logs. Sloan's written report was dismantled line by line. Maddox admitted she had not verified Langston's ID nor questioned the order to handcuff him. Sloan attempted to defend his intuition, but his voice cracked under cross-examination. Langston remained steady, his tone firm but not personal. "You were trained to de-escalate. You were trained to observe, to verify, to protect. You did none of those things." By evening, the panel delivered its verdict. Officers Sloan and Maddox were found in breach of duty, professional misconduct, and racial profiling. Immediate suspension without pay was enacted. A full criminal investigation was to follow. The chamber stood in silence as the judgment was read. Sloan didn't speak. Maddox nodded, once a tear sliding down her cheek. Langston rose. "Justice," he said, "must be blind to color, but never blind to truth. Let this be the beginning of that clarity." Outside the chamber, protesters had gathered in growing numbers. But when Langston stepped out, there was no roar, only silence. A heavy, reverent silence. Because justice in that moment had finally spoken. The hearing chamber inside the Michigan Capitol had never felt more alive or more haunted. Rows of polished oak benches were filled with journalists, legal experts, civil rights advocates, and members of the public lucky enough to secure a seat. Cameras were stationed at every corner, microphones angled forward like sentinels of truth. On the panel's elevated dais sat 3 judges, but at the center, calm and deliberate, was Judge Theodore Langston. No longer in handcuffs, no longer seated in a holding cell, but cloaked in the full dignity of his office. And yet beneath the robes and ritual, his hand still remembered the cold bite of metal. His voice, though clear, still echoed with the ache of being silenced. This was not just a legal proceeding, it was a reckoning. The case was simple in form, but devastating in implication. Officers Garrett Sloan and Renee Maddox, seated stiffly at the defense table, were facing formal misconduct charges, racial profiling, illegal search, and seizure, unlawful detainment, and abuse of authority. But they were not the only ones on trial. The institution they served the badge, the code, the culture, was being dissected in full public view. And for the first time in a long time, the system was not the one asking questions, it was answering them. Langston began the proceedings with a tone colder than the air in the room. This hearing is convened to examine conduct unbecoming of law enforcement. We are not here to relitigate public perception. We are here to evaluate the facts that were caught on camera, witnessed by citizens, and now stand in judgment. His gaze moved briefly to Sloan, then to Maddox, before settling on the documents before him. He did not flinch. He did not blink. The same man they had profiled was now the one deciding whether they would keep their badges. The prosecution opened with a powerful sequence first. The viral video played in its entirety. The footage showed Langston's calm composure, his clear voice requesting clarification, the illegal search, the handcuffing. Gasps rippled through the room as Sloan's voice was heard dismissing. Consent barking orders treating the judge like a trespasser in his own skin. Then came the body cam footage, which told an even darker story, edited statements, language of intimidation, blatant disregard for rights. None of Sloan's official report matched what the footage revealed. Maddox, visibly shaken, lowered her eyes when her own silence was spotlighted. The prosecutors didn't attack her. They asked her why she said nothing, why she didn't run the ID, why she placed cuffs on a man who posed no threat. Her voice cracked. "I was following protocol." I thought she stopped herself as if the truth had jammed in her throat. Langston watched her not with hatred, but with the weight of disappointed expectation. He had once believed the silent were merely complicit. Now he understood silence could be a symptom of fear. But that didn't make it harmless. When Sloan took the stand, he tried to regain control. He used phrases like reasonable suspicion, standard procedure, and gut instinct. But under cross-examination, his justifications collapsed. He admitted he hadn't checked Langston's ID. He admitted there was no confirmed stolen vehicle alert. He stumbled over legal definitions that, ironically, Langston himself had written opinions on. It wasn't just incompetence, it was exposure. The veil of presumed authority had been shredded. Throughout the hearing, Langston remained composed, but internally he wrestled with a storm. He had spent his life defending this system, mentoring young lawyers, believing reform could be shaped from the inside. And yet here he was proving what too many had screamed in protest. The system protects itself until it's forced to answer for its own reflection. Each testimony, each moment of denial, each hesitation, it was no longer just evidence. It was an indictment of a culture that had for too long mistaken power for righteousness. Closing arguments were brief but searing. The prosecution pointed to the pattern, not a one-time mistake, but an expression of systemic rot. Defense counsel tried to paint Sloan as overwhelmed Maddox, as a junior officer caught in a difficult situation, but the evidence left no room for ambiguity. Langston took a moment before announcing the panel's decision. He looked down at his hands, once cuffed, now gripping the very law that had failed to protect him. His voice was steady, unyielding. This panel finds Officers Sloan and Maddox in violation of multiple legal and ethical standards. Their actions reflect negligence, racial bias, and a fundamental failure to uphold the Constitution they swore to defend. Effective immediately, both are suspended without pay. This matter will be referred for further criminal investigation by the State Attorney General. Gasps, silence, then stillness. Sloan stared blankly ahead. Maddox nodded once, as if bracing herself for something overdue. And Langston rose, not as a man seeking vindication, but as a symbol of what happens when justice finally stares back. Behind him, the flags of the state fluttered in a sudden breeze from an open window, as if even the air had shifted. Because for the first time in a long time, the system had been forced to sit on the other side of the bench. 3 weeks later, the steps of the Michigan Law Enforcement Training Academy looked different, not just because the media had thinned or the signs outside had changed, but because of the faces inside. 52 cadets dressed in crisp Navy uniforms stood shoulder to shoulder under the morning sun eyes, straight-ahead boots anchored to the ground. For the first time they were graduating under a newly implemented code, one that included mandatory de-escalation training, racial bias awareness, and constitutional rights education. It was law enforcement rewritten from the inside out. And at the center of it, all invited, not as a cautionary tale, but as a founding voice, stood Judge Theodore Langston. He stood at the podium framed by the American flag and the seal of the Academy behind him. But his mind wasn't in the applause that greeted his presence. It was back in the rest stop under the sharp glare of suspicion. It was back in the cold holding chair, where his dignity had been measured against the color of his skin. It was back in the silence, the place where justice had nearly drowned. And now somehow here he was standing where the cycle began, not to relive it, but to end it. He adjusted the microphone with the same calm grace that had defined him through the hearing, through the headlines, through the humiliation. His voice rang out not loud but unshakable. 3 weeks ago I was handcuffed for sitting in my own vehicle wearing a suit reviewing case notes. I said nothing provocative. I gave no false statements. I offered my ID. I followed the law. And yet the law did not follow me. The silence among the cadets was reverent. No one blinked. No one shifted. The words didn't land like bullets, they landed like truth. I could have walked away bitter. I could have let rage consume me. But that's not why I stood firm. I stood because this profession, this badge, this oath must mean more than instinct and intimidation. It must mean judgment. It must mean courage, the courage to confront your bias before it becomes someone's trauma. Langston paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to become uncomfortable. There are those who will tell you that what happened to me was an isolated incident, he said. That's a lie we've told ourselves for decades. The truth is, what happened to me has happened in every city, every state, and every generation. The only difference is that I had a title and a camera. A few cadets swallowed hard. One young woman in the front blinked away tears. But your job, Langston continued, is not to protect a system that fears accountability. Your job is to build a system worthy of trust. That starts with how you see people not as threats, not as stereotypes, but as neighbors, as fathers, as mothers, as citizens who don't owe you fear in exchange for peace. He looked out over the sea of uniforms and saw something shift, not just in their posture, but in their awareness. These weren't just cadets, now they were witnesses. And witnesses carry weight. After the speech, as cadets filed out, one black recruit paused and turned back. He looked no older than 22, shoulder-squared eyes heavy with something deeper than pride. "Thank you, sir," he said quietly. Langston nodded. "Go serve with honor." Outside, the breeze moved through the line of state flags overhead. Langston remained on the academy steps, letting the wind wash over him like absolution. He thought not of Sloan or Maddox, not of hearings or headlines, but of the thousands whose stories had never been recorded, whose voices had never reached the courtroom. He thought of the man he could have become angry, hollow resigned, but he hadn't. He had chosen a different legacy, one not built on punishment but on purpose. Because justice, he now understood, is not a destination, it's a standard, and standards don't rise on their own. They are lifted one decision at a time, one moment of courage at a time, one refusal to stay silent when it's easier to look away. Langston turned from the academy steps and walked back to his car, not in defiance, not in triumph, but in truth. The journey wasn't over, but the foundation had been laid, and this time it bore his name. It was a quiet afternoon at the 12th Judicial Circuit Courthouse. No press, no protests, no spectacle. Just the hum of fluorescent lights above polished floors and the faint echo of law clerks shuffling papers behind oak-paneled doors. But down the center of the main hallway, framed by high arched ceilings and tall windows awash in golden light, walked a man who now meant something far larger than the robe he wore. Judge Theodore Langston, the man once mistaken for a criminal at a rest stop, now the symbol of a justice system forced to see itself moved, with measured steps toward his courtroom, not for a hearing, not for a ruling, but to take back what had been nearly stripped from him, not his position, but his peace. Outside, the world had kept moving. Officers Sloan and Maddox had been suspended pending criminal review, and a wave of departmental audits had begun statewide. Legal clinics had popped up in underserved communities offering free counsel to people wrongfully detained or profiled. Reform bills were circulating through the state legislature. Bias training standards were now being rewritten using footage of Langston's arrest as a core case study. But inside the courthouse, the walls remained unchanged. Same Latin inscriptions above doorways, same portraits of white justices staring down from a different era, their expressions frozen in time. It was as though the system itself refused to admit what it had done, and yet Langston kept walking. As he reached the doors of courtroom 3B, his courtroom, he paused. His reflection stared back from the brass handle, faint but distinct, a man shaped by law, betrayed by it, and yet still willing to serve it. The moment held weight. Behind those doors sat his bench, his gavel, his books, but they also held memories now. Every inch of that room had been altered by what happened, not physically, but spiritually. For Langston, justice would never again be theoretical. It had a face. His. He stepped inside. The room was empty except for his bailiff, who rose instinctively as he entered. Langston nodded, gesturing for him to sit. Slowly he approached the bench. The wood was cool beneath his fingertips, familiar yet foreign. He ran a hand along its edge, recalling the countless times he'd presided with composure and certainty. But now there was something more, a quiet awareness of how close justice could come to failing even those who dedicated their lives to it. He took his seat behind the bench, the elevated view now tinged with a different understanding. This was not just a seat of authority. It was a seat of responsibility, of humility, of vigilance. For years he had listened to stories from defendants, young black men pulled over without cause, searched without warrants, arrested without evidence. He had always believed them. But now he had lived it. He had felt the cuffs tighten, heard the doubt in their voices, experienced the silence that followed. And somehow in surviving it, he had not emerged smaller. He had emerged steadier. The chamber doors opened quietly. A court clerk entered to deliver a folder of new cases. She froze briefly when she saw him, then lowered her gaze. "Your Honor," she said softly, placing the file on the desk. He met her eyes not with weariness, but with a grounded intensity. "Thank you," he replied. She nodded, then exited, leaving him alone again in the stillness. Langston looked around. Sunlight filtered in through the high windows, catching the dust in midair like sparks. He exhaled slowly, not from exhaustion, but from acceptance. The system had tried to erase him and failed, but this wasn't just about survival. It was about transformation. His bench was no longer a platform for rulings alone. It was now a watchtower, one that would no longer tolerate bias in shadows or silence in the face of injustice. He reached for his gavel, not to strike it, just to feel its weight. The same weight that had once judged others now rested in the hand of a man who had been judged unfairly, and had chosen not to retreat, but to return. Not with bitterness, but with resolve. Outside the courthouse, a breeze swept through the trees, scattering fallen leaves across the courthouse steps. And in that still moment, as Langston sat alone in the heart of a system he had both defended and been betrayed, by one truth echoed louder than any verdict: justice doesn't always move. Sometimes it stands still, waiting, watching, refusing to yield, until the world is ready to catch up. And Judge Theodore Langston, no longer just a name in a courtroom, had become the stillness that changed everything. The story of Judge Theodore Langston offers a profound reminder that dignity, truth, and justice must never depend on titles, appearances, or assumptions. It teaches us that even the most accomplished individuals, those who have spent their lives upholding the law, are not immune to the pain of prejudice. Yet more importantly, it shows the strength of choosing grace over bitterness, purpose over vengeance. In the face of wrongful arrest and public humiliation, Judge Langston stood firm, not to punish but to reform. His journey reminds us that silence in the face of injustice is complicity, but calm resistance rooted in truth can shake even the most unyielding systems. For the elderly who have witnessed decades of change, this story reaffirms a timeless truth that wisdom, patience, and quiet courage can still move mountains. Justice doesn't always shout. It often waits still and steady in the hands of those brave enough to carry it forward. No matter your age, your voice, presence, and example still matter. And perhaps the greatest legacy we leave behind isn't just what we achieve, but what we refuse to accept in the world we pass on. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, give it a like and comment 1 if you found the story meaningful. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. See you in the next one.